The hall was built to hold 1,000 voices. Tonight, it held one sound, a small iron clasp, falling. It struck the altar stone and rang, clear and final, then rolled to a stop at the feet of the man who had just unmade her. Wren did not kneel for it. She was 24, dressed in the plain gray of an Omega bride. And one heartbeat ago, she had believed her whole life was about to begin. Then her name had been set down, quietly, like the wrong cup handed back to a servant, and another woman's name was picked up in its place. So she left the clasp where it lay, her mother's clasp, the only thing she had carried to that altar that was truly her own. She turned. She walked the length of that silent hall with her spine straight and her eyes forward, past every face she had ever known, and not one of them looked up. But someone did. High in the galleria, a hooded figure stood at the rail, broad as a doorway, still as stone. He was not watching the bride. He was watching the woman walking away. And though she would not understand it for a long while, the worst hour of her life had just become the first hour of something else entirely. A breath before the silence, the hall had been warm. Wren stood at the altar stone in the plain gray cloak of an Omega bride, and for one more heartbeat, she believed her whole life was about to begin. She had spoken 3 of her 4 mating vows. 3. The 4th was already rising in her throat, soft and certain, when Damon lifted one hand. Not a fist, not a slap, just a hand, raised the way a man stops a servant who has brought the wrong cup, and the great hall went still around her. She did not understand it at first. The body always understands these things last. She felt the silence before she knew its shape, felt the heat leave the room through the high stone windows, felt every gaze in that crowded hall slide off her face and land somewhere behind her left shoulder. Then Damon turned. He turned away from her, and toward the second row, where a noble's daughter waited in pale silk and gold. And he said her name, Celeste. He said it gently, as if correcting an honest mistake. The pack understood before Wren did. A pack always does. It moves like one animal, and the woman it is happening to is always the slowest to feel the turn. She watched the mate cloak lifted from the altar, the cloak that was meant for her shoulders. She watched it carried past her, close enough that she caught the cold scent of cedar and snow woven into the wool, the scent that should have wrapped around her own throat for the rest of her life. And she watched Damon settle it across Celeste's shoulders instead. His hands did the clasping that was meant to be Wren's. And the thing that begins a life began someone else's, in front of everyone she had ever known. She was 24 years old, and she was holding her mother's clasp. She had forgotten she was holding it. It was iron, plain, polished thin in places by 100 years of women's hands, and it had no business at a mating beside the silver the nobles wore. But it was hers, and it had been her mother's, and she had meant to wear it hidden beneath the cloak, where only he would ever know. Her fingers had gone numb around it. Then they began to shake, and the clasp slipped free. It struck the altar stone and rang, one small clear note in a silent hall. It rolled, a handspan, 2, and it stopped, at the feet of the man who had just unmade her. Wren looked down at it. A tiny circle of dark iron against pale stone, catching the candlelight. And in that moment, she understood something with terrible clarity. If she knelt to take it back, if she bent and scrabbled on the floor for her dead mother's iron in front of all of them, that would become the picture they kept of her forever. The omega on her knees, so she did not kneel. She left it where it lay. She lifted her chin, and she turned, and she walked the length of that hall with her spine straight and her eyes fixed on the doors at the far end. Past the noble families in their fine wool, past the warriors who had eaten at her table, past every face she had grown up among, and not one of them met her eyes. She told herself that was mercy. She knew it was not. The cloak felt heavier with every step, the gray wool dragging like wet ashes, and the scent of the hall pressed in on her. Beeswax and crushed pine, and the warm animal musk of 300 bodies that had come to watch her be chosen, and had stayed to watch her be discarded. Her heartbeat was very loud. Her face was very calm. She had learned somewhere in the long, quiet years of being the lowest in a high house that calm was the one thing they could never take from you if you refused to hand it over. So she walked, and she did not let them see it cost her anything at all. There was a gallery above the hall, a narrow stone balcony where the traveling folk and the unranked were permitted to stand and watch a ceremony they would never be part of. As Wren passed beneath it, she felt it, a weight, the way you feel a window open somewhere in a sealed room, a change in the air against the back of the neck, a pull low in the body that had no name yet. She looked up. High at the rail stood a figure in a hooded traveler's cloak, broad as a doorway, still as stone. She could not see his face, only the shape of him and the way the candlelight failed to reach beneath the hood. He was not watching the bride. The whole hall was watching the bride. He was watching the woman walking away, and for one strange, suspended breath, Wren felt seen, not pitied, not measured, not weighed against silk and gold, and found wanting, just seen. Then she passed beneath him, and out through the tall doors, into the cold blue evening. And behind her, though she did not turn to look, she had the oddest certainty that the figure at the rail had moved, that he was no longer standing there, that somewhere in the emptying hall a very large man was crossing a floor he had no reason to cross. She did not know who he was. She would not learn for a long time. Up in the gallery, Thorn stood without breathing. He had come to this hall for a treaty, and nothing more. A border matter. A handful of dull words to a regional alpha he did not respect. He had not meant to stay for the mating, but his wolf had gone quiet the moment she walked in. Not calm, quiet, the dangerous kind of quiet, the kind that comes over a great beast when it finally sees the one thing in the world it has been listening for. He had caught her scent from 40 feet of cold stone away. Honey and smoke and something underneath it that he had no word for. Something clean and unbroken that the gray cloak could not hide. And then he had watched a man set her down like an empty cup. Thorn's hands had closed on the rail until the old iron groaned. He told himself it was none of his concern. A king does not interfere between an alpha and his own Pax Omega. The law was the law, and the law had never once asked the woman how she felt about it. But then the little iron clasp had fallen. He had heard it ring. He had watched it roll to a stop at the feet of the man who would not even look down. And he had watched her choose, watched her decide in the space of a single breath. that she would rather walk away from her own mother's iron than kneel for it in front of the pack that had thrown her away. Something in his chest had pulled so hard he nearly went over the rail. Not pity. He despised pity. Pity was just contempt wearing softer clothes. This was something else. This was recognition. He had seen a great many strong people in his long life. Warriors, kings, beasts in the shape of men. He had almost never seen courage that quiet. So when she passed beneath the gallery and lifted her eyes to him, just once, he did not look away. He let her see the shape of him in the dark. And the moment she was gone through the doors, Thorn was already moving, down the gallery stair, through the side of the emptying hall, against the tide of murmuring bodies, to the altar stone where a small circle of dark iron lay forgotten in the candlelight, beneath the boots of men who had stopped caring about it the instant it stopped being useful. He knelt where she would not. He picked it up. It was warm still, from her hands, worn smooth, lighter than it looked, and heavier than it had any right to be. He closed his fist around it, and he made himself a promise he did not yet say aloud, not to her, not to anyone, that whatever else happened in the long world, no one would ever again make this woman feel small enough to leave her own heart lying on a floor. Wren did not go home. She had no home that would have her. An Omega returned from a broken mating is not a daughter. She is a debt. So she went up the high trade road into the mountains, where the air thins to glass and the only law is the weather, to a way station perched on the bones of the ridge, where an old woman named Della kept a fire burning for travelers who had nowhere softer to be. Wren told her she could work. Della looked at her hands, saw the small scars there, the kind that come only from years of honest labor in a house that gave you nothing but the labor, and she saw that those hands were not afraid, so she let her stay. That night, Wren lay on a narrow cot beneath a single rough blanket and listened to the wind work at the shutters, and pressed her empty palm to her chest where the iron clasp should have been. She told herself the worst was behind her. She was almost right. She just had the direction wrong. Because far below, on the long road home, a hooded king rode through the dark with a small piece of warm iron closed inside his fist, and a plan already beginning to take shape behind his eyes. The mountain did not care who she had been. That was the first kindness Wren had been shown in a long time, and it came from a place with no heart at all. Up here, the wind did not know she was an Omega. The cold did not know she had been chosen and then unchosen in front of 300 people. The stone and the pine and the thin, bright air asked her nothing about where she came from. They only asked whether she could work, and work was the one coin Wren had always been wealthy in, even when she had been wealthy in nothing else. Behind the way station, half buried in tall grass, stood 6 old hives that no one had tended in years. The keeper, Della, had waved a hand at them on the second morning and said they were more trouble than honey, that the bees had gone wild and mean, that a body could leave them be. Wren did not leave them be. She went out at first light, when the air was still cold enough to keep the bees slow and drowsy in their combs. She moved without fear, because she had learned long ago that fear is a scent, and that every living thing can smell it on you. She had no fear left to give them, so the bees took her measure and let her stay. By the turn of the first season, the 6 hives were thriving. By the turn of the second, she was making more candles and more mead than the high road could drink. Beeswax and honey and wood smoke. There are worse things to build a life out of. The candles were the thing she was proudest of. She dipped them slow, layer over layer, until they were smooth and heavy and gold as late afternoon. They smelled of warm honey and clean fire, and when she lit one in the long mountain dark, the whole small room softened around it. She was happy, in the careful, narrow way of a woman who has decided that happiness will be small and chosen and entirely her own. She would have stayed that way. She was almost sure of it, if the stranger had not started buying candles. He came in the autumn, the first time. Wren did not know he was a king. How would she? She knew only that he was the largest man she had ever seen stoop through that low door, that he had to turn his shoulders to fit, that he was dressed too plainly for the way he held himself, in dark wool with no crest and no color, the clothes of a man who did not want to be looked at. And she knew that he smelled of cedar and cold rain and something underneath it that made the back of her neck prickle in a way she did not have a word for. She set that feeling down where she set all such feelings now, somewhere far away, somewhere she did not have to touch it. He asked the price of a dozen beeswax candles. She told him, and he listened to the answer as if it were a matter of state. That was the strange part, not the size of him, not the quiet. It was the way he weighed her plain words about wax, as though they mattered, as though she mattered. He paid without expression. He took the candles in 2 enormous, careful hands, and he left. 3 days later, he came back for another dozen, which is a great many candles, Wren thought, for a man who does not look like he reads much in the dark. She did not say it. She wrapped the candles in clean cloth and took his coin and watched him fold himself back out through the low door, and she told herself it meant nothing. The third time, Della was watching from the kitchen, and the moment the door swung shut behind him, the old woman went very pale and pulled Wren by the wrist into the back room and shut that door too. "Do you know who that is?" Della whispered. "A man who likes candles." "That," Della said, "is Thorn." The name meant nothing to Wren, so Della said the rest of it, low and fast, the way you say a thing you are half afraid to say aloud. That he was the Lichen King, the eldest and the strongest of the great bloodlines. That the regional alphas spoke his name the way they wished their own names were spoken. That his fortress sat across the far ridge like a crouched animal, and that men rode for days simply to be permitted to stand in a room he was also standing in. "And he is up here," Della said, wringing her apron, "buying candles from you." Wren did not say anything. "Lichen kings do not buy candles, girl." Della's eyes were wide. "He is courting something." "Then he is courting it badly," Wren said. "He has not said one word to me that was not about wax." But something cold and bright had opened up under her ribs, because she knew now what that prickle at the back of her neck had been. She knew what it meant when a wolf that size went quiet in a doorway, and she had sworn on the floor of a silent hall, that she would never again let a powerful man decide the shape of her life. Across the far ridge, in a fortress of cold stone, Thorn was failing at something for the first time in many years. He was a king. He had broken sieges. He had held borders that older and crueler men had lost. He had stood in rooms where every other man was afraid, and he had not been afraid, because fear was a luxury a king could not afford, and he could not work out how to call upon a woman who made candles. It should have been simple. His wolf certainly thought it was simple. His wolf had decided the matter 40 feet across a crowded hall and had been unbearable about it ever since. A low, constant pressure behind his breastbone, a pull that turned his head north toward the mountain every time he let his attention slip. But Thorn did not trust his wolf in this. He had watched once, long ago, what it did to a woman when a strong man decided she was his, and never once asked her opinion of the matter. He had watched her fold inward year upon year, made small to fit a place she had never agreed to stand in. He had sworn he would never be the hand that did that to anyone. And now his wolf had chosen a woman he had watched be discarded. A woman who had already been claimed and thrown away by one man, certain he was right about her. The last thing on the earth she needed was a second man, certain he was right about her. So Thorn did not tell her what he was. He did not arrive with banners and a column of warriors and the weight of a crown, because all of that would only be one more powerful thing pressing down on a woman who had been pressed down enough. He bought candles instead. He bought candles because it gave him a reason to stand in her small warm room and listen to her voice, and because he could not think of a single honest reason he was permitted to give. It was, he was dimly aware, a foolish plan. He had a fortress full of advisers, and he had asked exactly one of them, his oldest, how a man went about courting a woman who had no wish to be courted by a king. The advice he had been given had clearly been given by someone who had never once done it either. Bring game, he had been told. Women appreciate a gift of game. So Thorn went out, and he hunted, and he came back to the way station with a brace of pheasants slung over one shoulder. And he presented them to Wren with the grave formality of a treaty. She looked at the birds, then she looked at him. "You hunt your own birds," she said. "I do not," he said. He considered the pheasants as though they had personally disappointed him. "I was advised that a gift of game was appropriate to the season, and to the—" He stopped. His jaw worked. "To the endeavor." Wren went very still. "The endeavor," she repeated. "Yes." She had not laughed in a very long time. She did not laugh then, either, because his face when he said the endeavor was the face of a man walking into deep, cold water in his good boots, and laughing would have been a cruelty she did not have in her, but something in her chest that had been a closed fist since the altar opened one finger. After the pheasants, the gifts grew stranger and somehow truer. He brought a book, a rare one, on the law and keeping of bees. Badly chosen, in that half of it was wrong, and the other half was older than the way station itself, but rare. The kind of thing a man acquires only by asking, with great seriousness, for the most learned text on a subject he knows nothing about. She read it by candlelight and found 3 errors in the first chapter and kept it anyway. He brought the next time a length of wool, soft, finely woven, warm enough for the high cold, and the exact gray of an Omega's cloak. He could not have known what that color did to her. He could not have known that the last time gray wool had touched her shoulders, she had been standing at an altar with 3 vows spoken and a 4th dying in her throat. He only knew, somehow, that she was cold up here. And so he had brought her something to be warm in, and by chance or by some instinct he could not name, he had brought it in the one color that undid her completely. She did not explain. She took the wool in both hands, and she felt the heat climb her throat, and she turned away so he would not see her face. And when she had mastered it, she thanked him, and she meant it more than he knew. He brought, after that, a folded paper, sealed, a formal written request, in a careful hand that was not his own, that he had clearly dictated and then made someone copy fair. It asked with enormous courtesy whether she might consider permitting him to call upon her on the third day of each week. Wren read it 4 times. She kept looking for the joke. She found instead only a man who had asked the people around him how this was done, and been given the wrong answer by people who had never done it either, and had tried anyway. And every single time, before he ducked back out through that low door, he asked her the same thing, in the same careful voice, as though her answer the week before could not be trusted to last. "You would tell me," he said, "if you wished me to stop coming." "I would tell you." "You are certain?" The next word cost him visibly. "That you are not obliged, by rank, to suffer this." And there it was, laid plain in the cold mountain air, a lichen king, the strongest of all the great bloodlines, standing in a candlemaker's small room, and asking her whether she was only enduring him because she did not believe she was permitted to refuse, as though he had seen, somewhere, what it does to a woman to be claimed by a man who has already decided for her, as though he were terrified of being, even by accident, the second man to do it. Wren stood very still in the honey gold light, the length of gray wool folded over the back of a chair, the rare wrong book open on the table, the smell of warm beeswax thick and sweet in the small room. And she understood that she was standing at the edge of something, that she could send him back down the mountain with a single word, and he would go, and never once make her feel the cost of it. That this was the strangest courtship in the world. A powerful man circling her at the careful distance of a guest, never closing the space he was so plainly aching to close, asking permission every week to keep asking permission. Down in the valleys, she knew, the whole territory had begun to talk. A discarded omega is beneath notice, but a discarded omega the lichen king rides up a mountain to buy candles from is suddenly the most interesting thing in the land. She could feel it gathering below her like weather. The murmurs, the watching, the danger in being looked at again by people who had once looked away. She knew what it would cost her if this went wrong. She knew exactly what the floor of a silent hall felt like against the soles of your feet when you walk away from it with your chin up and your heart in pieces. And still, when the third day of the week came round, she found that she had washed her hair. She found that she had set out 2 cups. She found that she was listening, without meaning to, for the sound of a very large man stooping through a low door, and the cold cedar scent of him filling her small, warm room. She did not tell him that. She was not ready to tell him that. She had been chosen once, loudly, in front of everyone, and unchosen in the same breath. If she was going to be chosen again, she wanted it slow. She wanted it quiet. She wanted this time to be the one doing the choosing. So when he asked, that third day, in that careful young voice, whether she wished him to stop coming, Wren looked at him for a long moment over the rim of her cup, and she said, "Come on the third day." A pause, and bring no more pheasants. Something moved across his face that he was not quick enough to hide, and though neither of them named it, the space between them in that small gold room had grown one careful step smaller. The third day of the week became the shape Wren's life turned around. She did not admit that to herself for a long while. She only noticed that the other 6 days had begun to feel like waiting. He came as the leaves went from gold to rust, to bare black branches against a hard white sky. He came as the first snows dusted the high road and then buried it. He came stooping through the low door with the cold still clinging to his wool, and that scent rolling off him. Cedar and rain and something deeper now. Something she had stopped pretending she did not lean toward when he passed. He never closed the distance. That was the thing that undid her, slow and sure, like water wearing a groove in stone. He stood where a guest stands. He sat where she gestured for him to sit. He left when he said he would leave, every time, even on the nights when she could see in the set of his great shoulders that leaving was the last thing his body wanted to do. And every visit, before he ducked back out into the dark, he asked the same careful question, whether she wished him to stop coming. And every visit, the answer came a little easier to her than the last. He brought, one week, honey cakes. He had made them himself. Badly. He presented them with the same parade ground dread he had shown the pheasants, holding the small cloth bundle out in 2 enormous hands, as if it might go off. Wren unwrapped them. They were lopsided, and one was scorched along its underside, and they smelled faintly of a man who had stood too close to his own oven and refused to step back. She ate 2 of them in front of him, slowly, so he would stop bracing for the verdict. And that was the day she stopped pretending to herself that she did not look forward to the 3rd day of the week. Once he arrived having clearly been told that a suitor ought to recite verse, and he recited it the way a man reads a sentence handed down by a court. 4 stanzas of some old lay about a king who waited 7 winters at a frozen ford for a woman who had not promised to come. He delivered it without a single breath of warmth, his eyes fixed on the middle distance, his voice flat as a wall. He was climbing one cold word at a time. When he finished, he went very still and waited the way he always waited for the verdict. Wren told him the poem was terrible, and that she had liked it anyway. He weighed this with enormous seriousness, and seemed, against all sense, encouraged. Then came the night the storm closed the road. It had been threatening all afternoon, the sky going the color of old iron, the wind picking up a thin, mean edge. Della had sniffed the air at the door and said no one was going anywhere tonight, and she had been right. By the time the 3rd day's visit should have ended, the snow was coming down so hard the world beyond the shutters had gone white and roaring. There was no question of him riding out into that. So for the first time, Thorne stayed. Della took herself off to bed early, with a look at Wren that said a great many things, and spoke none of them aloud. And the 2 of them were left alone, on opposite sides of the kitchen hearth, with the bees asleep in the walls, and the storm working at the shutters, and a single beeswax candle burning low and gold between them. For a long while, neither of them spoke. The fire ticked and settled. The snow hissed against the stone. And Wren found, in the warmth and the closeness and the dark, the courage to ask him the question she had been holding for weeks. Why candles? He did not answer at once. He turned the cup in his hands without drinking from it, the firelight moving over the broad plains of his face, and she watched him decide whether to give her the easy answer or the true one. "Because I needed a reason to come back," he said at last, "and I could not think of an honest one I was permitted to give." He set the cup down with great care, as though it were made of something far more fragile than clay. "My wolf knew you," he said, "before I had your name." The words landed in the quiet room like stones into still water. "I will not act on what my wolf knows," he went on, slower now, "as though it settles anything. A man's wolf knowing a thing does not make a woman owe him her life. It does not make her owe him a single hour." He looked at the fire, not at her. "So I bought candles, and I came back, and I waited to see whether the woman would choose what the wolf already had. You owe me nothing for the waiting." His voice dropped. "The waiting was mine to do." Wren turned that over and over while the fire settled. The heat of it warmed the side of her face. The candle between them threw their two shadows up the rough stone wall, very close together, though the bodies that cast them sat a careful arm's length apart. "Someone taught you to be this careful," she said softly. "No one is born braced like that." His hand went still on the cup. For a long moment she thought he would not answer. She had learned in the slow weeks of him not to chase the silences out of him. They were where he kept his true things. If you waited, sometimes one would come up on its own. "There was a woman," he said finally, "when I was young, not mine, not kin. I only watched." The fire popped. "A strong man took her," Thorne said. "A wolf who had decided she was his, and never once asked what she thought of it. He called it a mating. Everyone called it a mating. And I watched what it made of her, year upon year." His jaw was tight. His eyes were somewhere far away in a room a long time gone. "The slow folding inward," he said, "the way she got smaller, quieter, made herself less and less to fit a place she had never agreed to stand in. By the end, there was hardly a woman left inside the shape of her, just the space a strong man had decided she should occupy." He was quiet a moment. "I swore," he said, "that I would never be the hand that did that to anyone." He finally looked at Wren, and in the low gold light, the strongest man she had ever met looked almost afraid. "And then my wolf chose," he said, "and I understood that I could become the very thing I hate, without ever raising my voice, without ever raising my hand, simply by being certain I was right about you, by deciding your life was a thing I got to know better than you did." He let out a slow breath. "So I am certain of nothing," he said, "except the candles. I am quite certain about the candles." It was the most he had ever said at once, and every word of it was a man laying down, one at a time, weapons he had been trained from birth to keep raised. Wren sat with it. The storm, the fire, the smell of wood smoke and warm wax and the cold cedar of him, all braided together in the small dark room. She did not tell him, that night, that something in her had already chosen, quietly, somewhere around the second dozen candles. She had been chosen once, loudly, in front of everyone, and unmade in the same breath. She wanted to be sure that he, of all men, understood being made to wait. So she did not say it, but she did something she had not done since the altar. She let the silence be soft. She let it be the kind of silence two people share, rather than the kind one person endures. And when the candle guttered low, and she rose to find another, her hand passed close to his on the hearthstone, close enough that she felt the heat of his skin against the back of her fingers, close enough that his breath caught audibly in the dark. Neither of them moved to close it, but neither of them moved away either. And it was, Wren thought, lying awake long after on her narrow cot, with her heart going like a drum, the most she had felt about anything in a very long time. Across the ridge, in his cold fortress, Thorn did not sleep at all that night. He stood at a high window and watched the same storm batter the mountain that held her, and he pressed one hand flat against his own chest, where the pull lived. It had been quiet these last weeks, content almost, because for the first time it was being fed not by what the wolf had taken, but by what the woman was slowly choosing to give. He had told her things tonight he had told no one. The folded woman, the vow, the fear that lived in him still, that one day he would wake up certain he knew her better than she knew herself, and that she would smile and let him, because the world had already taught her that this was what happened to women like her. He would die before he let that happen to her. He understood that now, with the clean, cold certainty of a thing decided. What he did not understand, what kept him at the window long into the howling dark, was the look on her face when he had recited that terrible poem, the way she had told him it was terrible, and that she had liked it anyway. As though she saw straight through the parade ground armor of him, as though she had decided to like the frightened man underneath it. No one had looked at him that way in his whole long life. He had been feared, he had been obeyed, he had been wanted for his crown and his strength and his name. He had never once been seen, and the woman who saw him was a candle maker on a mountain, who had been thrown away by a smaller man, and who was, Thorn was coming to understand, worth more than every lord and lady in the valleys below put together. The valleys, of course, did not see it that way. Not yet. But the valleys had begun to talk. The news came up the mountain the way bad news always does. Slowly at first, then all at once. It came on the boots of a trader who stopped at the way station to wait out the worst of the snow, a thin man with quick eyes who warmed himself at Della's fire and ran his mouth the way some men do, for the simple pleasure of being the one who knows things. He did not know who Wren was. He only knew the gossip of the territory, and he spent it freely. The Lichen King, he said, had gone strange. Everyone said so. He had stopped holding court the way he used to. He rode out alone, north, into the high country, week after week, and would not say why. There were wagers in 3 holds about what woman had caught him, and what house she came from, and how much her family would gain by it. Wren kept her eyes on her candles. Her hands did not stop moving. Dip and lift and cool and dip again. But she was listening, and the trader, warming to his audience, went on. There was talk, he said, in the pack of a certain regional alpha, a mating that had soured. The noble daughter the alpha had chosen instead of his promised omega had turned out to be all silk and no warmth. She had wanted a Luna's life, and instead she had a sulking alpha and a hold full of people who whispered behind their hands. And worst of all, the trader said, lowering his voice with relish, Worst of all, the discarded Omega had not had the decency to disappear. She had gone up a mountain, the story went, and somehow, no one quite knew how, she had caught the eye of a king. Wren's hands went still, just for a breath. The wax cooled gray on the wick before she remembered to lift it. The Alpha, the traitor said, was beside himself. He had thrown the Omega away like a worn cloak, certain she was worth nothing, certain no one would ever look twice at her again. And now the strongest bloodline in the land was riding north every week, and the Alpha had begun to wonder, out loud, whether he had made a mistake, whether the Omega had been worth something after all, whether there might still be a way to take her back. After all, the traitor said, grinning into the fire, by the old law she was promised to his pack and never properly released. A man could make an argument that she still belongs to him. If a man thought she was suddenly worth the trouble of arguing. Della had gone very quiet by the stove. Wren set down her candle. She did not let her face change. She had spent her whole life learning to keep her face from changing, and she did not waste that hard learning now. But underneath, something cold had walked down the length of her spine, because she understood, with perfect clarity, the shape of what was coming for her. She had been worth nothing to Damon when she stood at his altar in plain gray wool with 3 vows spoken and her whole heart open. He had set her down like the wrong cup, gently, in front of everyone. And now that another man had looked at her, now that her value had been measured by someone else's wanting, now she was suddenly worth taking back. That was the part that turned her stomach. Not the danger, the reason for it. She had not changed. She was the same woman who had walked the length of that silent hall with her chin up. The same hands, the same heart. The same worth she had always carried that he had been too small to see. The only thing that had changed was that a king now wanted what Damon had thrown away. And so, to Damon, she had become worth wanting. Not for herself, never for herself, only for what another man's interest said about her price. Wren walked to the small window and looked out at the white, roaring dark, in the direction of the valleys she had climbed so far to escape. She thought of the cloak being carried past her, the clasp ringing on the stone, the faces that would not meet her eyes. She thought of the man across the ridge who asked her every single week whether she was only suffering him, who would not close a single inch of distance she had not first invited him to close. 2 men. One had decided her worth without ever once looking at her. The other was so terrified of deciding anything for her that he bought candles he did not need and made honey cakes he could not bake, just to earn the right to keep asking. She had spent her whole life being told what she was worth by men who had never bothered to ask her. She was done with that. She did not yet know how she was going to be done with it. But standing at that small, cold window, with the storm screaming down off the peaks and a half-made candle cooling in her steady hands, Wren made herself a quiet promise. Whatever was riding up this mountain toward her, Damon's old claim, or the king's careful heart, or the whole watching weight of the territory below, this time the choosing would be hers. Behind her, the fire cracked. The traitor, oblivious, asked Della if there was more stew. And far across the dark ridge, a king who could not sleep turned from his window with a sudden cold certainty that something was wrong, though he could not yet have said what. His wolf had gone very still, the dangerous kind of still. the kind that comes when the thing it has chosen is about to be threatened. The storm broke before dawn, the way storms do, all at once, and then never having happened. The traitor went on his way with the first clear light, his gossip packed up beside his goods, and he never knew what he had carried up that mountain and set down in a candlemaker's kitchen. He left a cold thing behind him. It sat in Wren's chest all that day and the next, through every dipped candle and every poured measure of mead. The knowledge that the valleys had remembered her. That somewhere below, a man who had thrown her away was beginning to reconsider the price of what he had dropped. She told herself she would not let it touch the third day. She was wrong about a great many things in those weeks. She was wrong about that too, because when Thorn came stooping through the low door that third day, with the meltwater still beating on his dark wool and the cold cedar of him filling the small warm room, something had shifted in both of them. The storm had done it. The long night across the hearth, the things he had said into the fire, the way her hand had brushed his, and neither of them had pulled away. It had moved something that could not be moved back. He felt it the moment he crossed the threshold. His wolf came up under his skin like a tide, and it took everything he had to keep his voice level, to set down the small wrapped thing he had brought her, to stand where a guest stands. She felt it too. She felt it in the way the room seemed smaller, in the way her own breath went shallow when he straightened to his full height, in the way her body, which she had kept on so tight a leash for so long, leaned a half-inch toward him before her mind caught up and stopped it. The pull between them had a weight now. It had a heat. "You are well," he said. It was not quite a question. His eyes moved over her face the way a man checks a thing he is afraid to find changed. "The storm kept us in," she said. "A traitor waited it out by the fire." Something flickered in his expression. "And told tales," he said quietly. "And told tales." He went still. He did not ask what the traitor had said. He never pressed her. But she watched him understand, the way he understood everything about her, slow and sure, and without needing it spelled out. That the world below had found her again. That she was afraid, and the careful guess distance he had held all these weeks wavered. Wren. Her name in his mouth was low and rough. He had never said it like that before. He had hardly let himself say it at all. She looked up at him, and the small room with its honey gold light and its sleeping bees seemed to draw in close around the two of them, until there was nothing in the world but the heat coming off his great body and the cedar and rain scent of him and the way he was looking at her as though she were the only solid thing in a falling world. He lifted one hand, slowly, giving her every chance to step back, and when she did not step back, he set his palm against the side of her face. It was the first time he had touched her on purpose in all these weeks. His hand was enormous and warm, and it shook, very slightly, against her jaw. She felt the calluses of it, the care in it, the vast leashed strength held so gently that a bird could have slept in his grip. Her eyes fell shut. She had not been touched with tenderness in so long that her whole body did not know what to do with it. Something cracked open in her chest, wide and aching, and she heard herself make a small sound she had not meant to make. "I will not close this," he murmured. His thumb moved once, just once, along the line of her cheekbone. Not the last of it. That is yours to close. It has always been yours. She opened her eyes. He was so close now that she could see the gold flecks in his dark gaze, the way his pupils had blown wide, the muscle jumping in his clenched jaw with the effort of holding himself exactly where he was. The bond sang between them. She could feel it. A low golden thrum, like a struck string, like the whole mountain holding one note. She rose onto her toes. She closed her hand in the front of his wool, where it was still cool and damp from the snow, and she drew the breath that meant she was about to do the thing neither of them had let happen. And his mouth came down to meet hers. It was not loud. It was not the kind of kiss the songs are written about, the kind made in front of crowds to prove a thing to watching eyes. It was slow and warm and devastatingly gentle for so large a man, his hand sliding back to cradle her skull as though it were something he had been trusted with and meant to be worthy of. She felt the breath go out of him, like a man setting down a weight he had carried for years. She felt his other arm come around her, careful even now, drawing her in against the broad, warm wall of him until she could feel his heart going hard and fast beneath the wool. And she felt the bond catch, not finish, not complete. That took more than a kiss. But catch, the way a flame catches dry tinder, a deep, golden heat unspooling out from her chest into every part of her, into him, between them, a warmth with her name written all the way through it. For one long moment, the woman who had been thrown away on a cold floor was held by a king as though she were the most precious thing in the world. And she let herself believe it. That was the moment, she would think later, that the world chose to break. Because that was when the rider came. The pounding of hooves on the frozen road. A horn, 3 short blasts. The call that means a king is needed, and needed now. Thorn's head came up, his whole body going taut, the wolf surging into his eyes. For one heartbeat, he did not let her go. For one heartbeat, he held her tighter, and a low sound came out of his chest that was almost a growl, the sound of a creature that has finally found the thing it wants and is being torn away from it. Then the discipline of a lifetime won. He stepped back. His hands stayed on her shoulders. His forehead dropped to rest against hers. His breath ragged and warm against her mouth. "I have to go," he said, low, furious, helpless. "There is a matter at the fortress that will not wait. I would not leave you now for anything smaller." "I know," she said. "I will come back. I know that too." He pressed his mouth to her brow, once, hard, a promise more than a kiss. And then he was gone, folding himself out through the low door into the white morning, swinging up onto a horse too small for him, gone down the road in a spray of snow with the rider hard behind. Wren stood in the doorway with her hand pressed to her own lips, and the warmth of him still all over her skin, and the bond still humming low and gold in her chest. She did not yet know that he had left something behind. He always did, in the end. A man like that leaves a reason to return. This time, it was a saddlebag. It had slipped from the second horse in the rush of leaving, fallen against the wall by the door, and Della found it that evening and asked Wren to set it inside out of the wet. It was heavy at one corner, and the buckle had worked loose, and curiosity has always been the one sin a lonely woman is least sorry for. So Wren looked. She told herself it was only to fasten the buckle properly, to keep the contents dry until he came back for it. But her hands had already loosened the flap. Inside there was a folded order, in a steward's careful hand, sealed with the crest of the Lichen King. She should not have read it. She read it, and the warmth went out of her, inch by inch. The way the heat had gone out of the great hall on the night her name was set down. Because the order was old, months old. It was dated in the dry, careful way of such things, to the very week of her mating that was not a mating. The week she had walked the length of a silent hall and climbed into the mountains with nothing but her own 2 hands. And it gave instructions that a certain way station on the high road be supplied through the winter, quietly, without explanation, that its keeper be paid just as quietly to take on any worker who came to her door asking for work, and to ask no questions of where that worker had come from. That a woman who might come keeping bees be left entirely to her own work and her own peace, and that she be approached by no one, on pain of the king's displeasure, until further word. Wren read it once, then she read it again, slower, her hands gone cold. He had not found her in the autumn. He had set her here in the spring. He had been the hooded figure in the gallery. He had stood at that rail and watched her walk away with her chin up and her heart on the floor. And then, instead of coming to her, instead of speaking a single word, he had gone home, and he had arranged it, all of it, the way station that had taken her in, the old woman who had looked at her hands and let her stay, the peace of half a year on a mountain where no one came looking, where she had thought she was hidden, where she had thought she had built something with her own bare hands that no one could take from her. He had built it. He had built her sanctuary and then stayed away from it for half a year so that when he finally came, she would already be standing on her own feet, in a life that felt like hers, free to send a king back down the mountain if she chose. And beneath the order, wrapped in a square of plain cloth, was her mother's clasp, the iron one, the one she had left ringing on the altar stone, the one she had walked away from rather than kneel for in front of the pack that threw her away. He had it. He had had it all this time, through the pheasants and the bee-law book and the gray wool and the badly made honey cakes, through every careful week of asking whether she was only suffering him. He had carried her mother's iron in his fist the entire time, and never said a word. Wren sat down very slowly on the cold floor of that kitchen, the clasp in one hand and the order in the other, and she did not know what she felt. That was the worst of it. She did not know. Part of her wanted to weep with the tenderness of it. No one in her whole life had been that careful with her. No one had picked her dignity up off a floor and kept it safe and given her a spring and a summer and a stand of bees and the dignity of arriving on her own 2 feet. She had not known a person could be that gentle. But another part of her, an older and more frightened part, had gone very cold and very still. Because she had thought she chose this. She had stood at that small cold window in the storm and made herself a quiet promise that this time the choosing would be hers. She had believed, all these weeks, that she was a free woman on a mountain who had caught a king's eye and was deciding, slowly and carefully, whether to let him in. And now she held the proof that the mountain itself had been his doing, that the work she was so proud of had been propped up by his coin, that the keeper who had taken her in had been paid to do it, that the very solitude she had built her healing on had been a thing he gifted her, the way a man gifts a cage with a door left open and calls it freedom. Had any of it been hers? Had she chosen him? Or had she only walked the path he laid down for her, certain her feet were her own, the way she had once stood at an altar, certain her life was about to begin? Two men. One had decided what she was worth without ever looking at her, and the other had decided what she needed and arranged her whole world to provide it, so quietly and so kindly that she had never once felt the strings. She did not know which frightened her more, a loud man who takes what he wants, or a gentle one who is certain he knows best. She closed her hand around the iron until its worn edge bit into her palm, and she made herself a different promise this time, that she would not be grateful into a cage, that she would not let tenderness do to her quietly what cruelty had failed to do loudly, that the next thing she chose, she would choose with her eyes open, knowing exactly whose hands had built the room she stood in. That was how Hollis found her. The king's beta, a gray slab of a man with an old soldier's patience, who had come ahead to fetch the saddlebag his king had dropped and saw at once, from the doorway, exactly what she was holding. He did not pretend. That was the one mercy in it. He did not insult her by pretending. He lowered himself onto the bench across from her, slow, the way old soldiers sit. He would not let any of us speak of it, Hollis said quietly. Not the order, not the clasp, not one word, on pain of more than his displeasure. Wren did not look up from the iron in her hand. He watched that alpha shame you, Hollis went on, stood at that rail and watched it, and could do nothing. By the old law, a king does not interfere between an alpha and his own pax omega. Not without cause, the council would hear. The beta's voice was flat and tired. He raged for a month. I have served him a long time, and I had never seen him rage. Then he stopped raging, and he started planning. He nodded at the clasp. He took that off the altar himself, he said. After the hall emptied, knelt down on the stone where you would not, in front of no one, and picked it up. He has carried it since. I think he means to find a way to give it back to you. A pause. I do not think he has worked out how. Wren sat with the cold iron biting into her palm, and the cold floor under her, and the cold truth settling over her like the snow settling over the high road. He had seen her at her most discarded, and instead of pity, instead of rescue, instead of swooping down to save the poor, thrown away, Omega, he had given her a mountain to heal on, and stayed away so she could do it alone, and kept her mother's heart safe in his fist until she was strong enough to take it back. It was the kindest thing anyone had ever done for her, and she had no idea, sitting there on that cold floor, whether it meant she was free, or whether it meant she had simply traded one man's certainty about her life for another's. She closed her eyes, and in the dark behind them, the bond he had refused to finish still hummed, low and golden and patient, waiting, as he had taught it to wait, for her to decide. He came back 3 days later than he had said he would. That was the first thing Wren noticed. In all the careful weeks of him, he had never once been late. He left when he said he would leave. He came when he said he would come. He had built his whole quiet courtship on the promise that his word to her was a thing she could set her weight on. and now he was 3 days late. She understood why the moment he ducked through the low door. Hollis had ridden ahead. Hollis had told him. She could see it in the way Thorn stood, just inside the threshold, not coming any closer. In the way his great shoulders were set, braced, the way a man braces for a blow he believes he has earned. He did not reach for her. He looked at her hands, at the iron clasp resting on the table between them, unwrapped now, plain and dark in the honey gold light. And the king who had broken sieges could not make himself speak first. So Ren spoke. "You set me here," she said. It was not a question. "Yes." "In the spring. The week he threw me away." "Yes." "You paid Della to take me in. You kept the road supplied. You ordered that no one come near me." Her voice did not shake. She had decided it would not shake. "You built the place I came to think I had built for myself." Thorn closed his eyes. "Yes," he said. "I did all of it." He did not explain it away. That was the thing she had braced for, and it did not come. He did not say it was for her own good. He did not say she would have starved without him, or frozen, or worse. He did not turn his kindness into a debt she owed. He simply stood there in the doorway and let her hold the whole weight of it. "I have spent these weeks," he said at last, very low, "terrified that you would find that order. Because the moment you read it, you would know that I am exactly the thing I swore I would never be. A man who decided what your life should look like, who arranged it, who built you a world and waited for you to live in it and call it your own." He opened his eyes. They were wet, and he did not hide it. "I told myself it was different," he said. "I told myself I was giving you a place to stand instead of taking one away. I told myself that a cage with the door left open is not a cage." His jaw worked. "But the door was still mine to leave open. The choice to open it was still mine. And a man who gives a woman her freedom is still a man who decided she could have it." Ren said nothing. She was learning slowly that the most powerful thing in a quiet room is the silence you refuse to fill. So, Thorn reached into his wool and drew out a second folded paper. He set it on the table beside the clasp and stepped back from it. "This undoes it. All of it. The keeper is paid through the season regardless of what you decide. That much I will not take back, because I will not make your roof depend on your answer. But everything else is yours now. The road, the work, the peace. None of it owes me anything. None of it ever did." He looked at her across the small, warm room. "And if you tell me to go," he said, "I will go. Down this mountain, and I will not come back. And I will not send for you. And I will spend whatever is left of my reign making certain no shadow of mine ever falls across your door again. You will never have to see me. You will never have to wonder if a candle is only a candle." His voice broke, just slightly, on the last of it. "You owe me nothing, Ren. Not your gratitude, not your anger, not one more hour. The waiting was always mine." And then he did the hardest thing. He picked up the iron clasp, and he held it out to her, across the space he would not close, on his open palm. "This is yours," he said. "It was always yours. I only kept it safe. Take it and tell me to go. And it ends here." Ren looked at the clasp lying on his huge open hand. Her mother's iron, worn thin by 100 years of women's hands, the thing she had walked away from rather than kneel for. And she did not take it. Not yet, because she understood, standing there, that she was being given something almost no one is ever given. A true choice, not the false choice of the altar, where the only options had been to kneel and be shamed or walk away and be unmade. Not the soft cage of gratitude, where saying yes would only mean she had been managed into it. A real one. He had laid down every advantage, his rank, his strength, his secret, the clasp itself. He had made himself as powerless as he could possibly be, here in her small kitchen, so that whatever she chose next, she would choose it as a free woman, and nothing less. That was the difference. She saw it then, whole and clear, the way you see the shape of a thing only after staring at it in the dark for a long time. Damon had chosen her once, loudly, in front of everyone, to prove something to himself, and he had unchosen her just as loudly when the proving was done. He had never asked her a single question. He had decided what she was worth, and then decided she was worth less, and at no point in any of it had her own voice mattered at all. And now he wanted her back. Not because he had learned to see her, because another man's wanting had finally put a price on her that he could understand. That was a man who used a woman to measure himself. This was a man kneeling in an empty hall to pick her dignity up off the floor, and then spending half a year making sure she would never need him to do it again. One had taken her voice. The other had spent everything he had to hand it back to her. They were not the same. They had never been the same. She had only been so badly hurt that for a moment she could not tell tenderness from control, because the world had taught her that both of them ended the same way, with a woman made small. But this man had built her a place to grow large, and then begged her to send him away if that was what she wanted. "I am not going to take the clasp," Wren said. Thorn's face went still. "Not yet," she said. "Not from your hand, with go or stay tied to it. That is still a choice you are handing me, and I am tired of being handed things." She lifted her chin. "When I take it, I will take it because I have decided, not because it was offered." Something moved in his eyes. Not relief. He was too disciplined for relief. But something. "Then what do you wish?" he said quietly. "I wish," Wren said, "to know what I am choosing. All of it. No more orders I find by accident in a saddlebag." She met his gaze. "What is coming? Tell me what is coming." So he told her. The traitor had not been wrong. The valleys were talking. And Damon, that small, certain man, had begun to do more than talk. He had gone to the council. He had begun to argue in the careful, poisonous way of men who have found a law that suits them, that Wren had been promised under pack right and never properly released. Shamed, yes. Set aside, yes. But by the oldest law, not released. The bond thread that ties an omega to her birth pack does not break because an alpha turns his back. It must be cut, with the proper words, by the proper hands. And until it was cut, Damon argued, she still carried his pack's bond inside her, which meant, by the oldest law, that no alpha could take her, not even a king. "He means to use the law to drag me back," Wren said slowly. "He means to use the law to stop me from ever having you," Thorn said. "Whether he takes you back or not, he does not much care. He only cannot bear that the thing he threw away might become a queen. So he reaches for the one weapon that even a king cannot simply break: the old law, the bond no one ever asked you whether you wished to carry. He was quiet a moment. There is a right, he went on, old and binding, a lunar presentation. When a king takes a luna, the regional alphas are commanded to come to the high fortress and pledge to her before the council. It is how a chosen mate is made true in the eyes of every pack. Attendance is not a request. It is commanded. Ren understood then where this was going. You mean to present me, she said. I mean to present whomever I choose, he said carefully. And I will not choose for you, Ren. I will not stand you up in front of that hall as my Luna, and let it become one more thing decided about your life. If you come because you have decided to. And if you come, his voice dropped, then Damon will be there, commanded, like all the rest, and he will make his claim in front of the whole council, and the old law will be on his side. And you cannot simply override it. No. The word was heavy. If I override the old law to take what I want, then I become exactly the king I have spent my whole reign refusing to be. A man who decides the law bends for his wanting. I will not do that. Not even for this. He looked at her. Not even for you. It should have frightened her. A law she could not break. A man waiting in that hall to reach back across the worst day of her life and pull her into it again. The whole weight of every pack in the land gathered to watch. But Ren found, sitting in her small warm room with the snow settling soft on the high road, that she was not afraid. She was something else. She was steady. Because she had spent her whole life being a thing that was decided, promised, and chosen, and unchosen, and now claimed again, by men who passed her between them like a clasp on a chain, none of them ever once asking the woman what she wanted. And here, at last, was a man who would rather lose her to the law than win her by breaking it, who would rather hand her a hard true choice than an easy false one. He was offering her a door, a terrible, dangerous door that led into a hall full of everyone who had ever looked away from her, but a door she could walk through on her own 2 feet, or not walk through at all. I have a question, Ren said. Ask me anything. This old law. She turned the shape of the bond over in her mind. The words of release she had heard spoken once over another woman, long ago. It speaks of releasing me to my pack, of the proper hands cutting the thread. It does. Has it ever, she said slowly, once asked the woman whether she wishes to release herself? Thorn went very still. She watched the thought land in him, watched him turn it the way he turned everything, slow and careful, looking for the flaw in it. No, he said at last, and there was something like wonder in his voice. In all the long years of it, the law speaks of packs, and alphas, and proper hands. It has never once asked the bondholder herself. He looked at her. Because it never occurred to the men who wrote it that she might want to. Then there is a door no one has thought to close, Ren said. And for the first time since he had stooped through that low door 3 days late, the corner of Thorn's mouth moved. She did not take the clasp that night. She made him leave it on the table when he went. But after he had gone, after the sound of his horse had faded down the dark road, Ren sat alone in the honey gold light with her mother's iron in front of her, and she did not feel the bitter thing she had carried since the altar. She felt the bottom drop out of it, and underneath, where the bitterness had been, something steady and quiet, and entirely her own. She picked up the clasp. She held it in her scarred working hands, the way her mother had held it, the way 100 women before them had held it. All of them passed between men. None of them ever once asked. And she made her choice, not the choice to go to him. That would come, if it came, in front of the whole world, on her own terms. The choice she made, alone in that small warm room, was the deeper one, that she would walk down the mountain, that she would stand in that hall in front of every face that had looked away, that she would let Damon make his claim, and let the old law settle cold over the room, and let them all believe, for one more breath, that she was a thing to be decided. And then she would do the one thing none of them had ever imagined an Omega doing. She would release herself. She rose, and she went to the small chest where she kept what little was hers, and she set the iron clasp inside it, safe until the day she would carry it down the mountain. Outside, the snow had stopped. The sky had cleared to a hard, bright field of stars, and far across the dark ridge, in a cold fortress, a king lay awake feeling something he had not felt in his whole long, careful life. Not the pull of the bond, something quieter, the feeling of a man who has handed a woman the last of his power and watched her grow taller, holding it. He did not know yet what she meant to do, but his wolf had gone calm, the deep calm, the kind that comes not when a thing is taken, but when a thing, at long last, is freely chosen. The high fortress had not seen a gathering like it in living memory. Every regional alpha in the land had been commanded, and every regional alpha had come. They filled the great hall in their fine wool and their bright steel, their wolves close beneath their skin, their eyes hungry for the one thing none of them had been told. Who had the Lycan King chosen? The whole territory had wagered on it for a season. A noble daughter, surely. A great house. Some careful alliance of blood and border. They had come to bend the knee to a queen, and they did not yet know her name. And the not knowing had them leaning forward in their seats like hounds before a hunt. Damon was among them. He had come because he was commanded, and for no other reason. He expected to kneel to some pampered lady, mutter the old pledge, and be home before the moon turned. He sat near the front in clothes a shade too fine, certain of his small, certain world, his claim already filed with the council, his argument already sharpened. He did not know. None of them knew. Then the great doors at the far end opened, and a woman walked the length of that hall toward the dais where the king stood. She wore the deep blue of a Luna. The cloak fell from her shoulders to the stone floor, the color of the sky in the last moment before full dark, and it moved around her as she walked like water, like weather, like something that had always belonged on her and had only been waiting for her to claim it. She walked with her spine straight and her eyes forward, past every face in that hall, and this time every single one of them looked up. Wren felt the change in the room before she was halfway down the aisle. The last time she had walked the length of a great hall, she had walked away from an altar with her heart on the floor, and not one face had met her eyes. They had given her the small mercy of looking away. This time, they could not look away if they tried. She felt the weight of 300 gazes land on her and stay, felt the murmur ripple out from the front rows, where the alphas who traveled, who heard things, who carried gossip like coin, began to recognize the shape of a story they had only half believed. The discarded Omega, in a Luna's cloak, walking toward the strongest king in the land as though the floor had been laid for her feet alone. And then she found him in the crowd. Damon. She felt the exact moment he understood. It took the same single heartbeat it had taken her once at his altar. That long suspended instant where the body knows before the mind will let it. She watched the color drain out of his face, watched his certain little world tilt under him, watched him half rise from his seat, his mouth opening on a denial, a protest, a no that the whole hall would have heard. She did not let herself feel nothing. She would not pretend later that there had been no satisfaction in watching the face of the man who had let her mother's clasp ring on the stone and never once looked down. But she did not slow her step for him. He was not the point. He had never been the point. She had simply stopped, somewhere on the long road down the mountain, arranging her life around the men who threw things away. She reached the foot of the dais. She looked up at Thorn, and for one breath, in front of the whole watching world, the bond between them sang so loud and so golden that she was almost certain the council could hear it. Then Damon found his voice. "This female is bound to my pack." The words cracked across the hall like a whip, pitched to carry, and the murmur died into a hard silence. He was on his feet now. The shock had passed, and underneath it was the thing she had always known lived in him. Not love, not even wanting. Pride. The pure cold pride of a man who could not bear to be made small in front of his peers by a woman he had decided was worthless. She was promised under pack right, Damon said to the council, to the hall, to the king himself, and she was never released. Shamed, yes. Set aside, yes. But released, no. The bond thread to my pack stands in her still. He spread his hands. Reasonable, ruinous. By the oldest law, he said, no alpha may take a female who carries another pack's bond. And the king is not exempt from the law he keeps. He let that land. Let it spread. Return her to her pack for proper release, and perhaps we will speak again of presentations. Until then, this right is void, and the king knows it. The hall erupted, and the worst of it was. He was right. Wren felt the truth of it move through the room like cold water finding the low places. She saw the council members glance at one another, saw the old law settle over them, heavy and ancient and unanswerable, saw exactly what Damon had seen, that this was the one weapon even a king could not simply break. Because if Thorn broke it, if he stood up and declared the law did not apply to his wanting, then he would become, in front of every pack in the land, the very thing he had spent his whole reign refusing to be. A king who takes what he wants and calls it law. Wren turned and looked up at him, and she saw him understand that too. Thorn rose. He did not rise the way a king rises to crush a smaller man. He rose slowly, heavily, the way a man rises when he knows the next thing he does will cost him something he can never get back. The hall fell silent. "He speaks true," the Lycan king said. The shock of it went through the room like a blade. 300 breaths caught at once. The council members froze. Even Damon, for one instant, looked uncertain, as though his victory had come too easily to trust. "The law is the law," Thorn said. His voice was steady, and it carried to the farthest cold corner of that hall. I will not break it, not for my pride, not for my crown. He looked down at Wren, only at her, as though the crowded hall had emptied and there were no one left in all the world but the two of them. Not even for her. The words should have broken her. They did the opposite, because she heard, underneath them, the door he was opening. The same door he had laid down for her the whole way up the mountain. The same door he had refused to walk her through himself. So I set my claim aside, Thorn said. Here, before the council, in front of every pack in the land. I make no demand of this woman. I will submit to the council's inquiry, and I will abide whatever it finds, whatever it costs my standing, whatever it costs me. His jaw tightened. Because the one thing I will not do is be a second man who decides her life for her. He took one step down from the dais, toward her, and stopped. The bond is yours, Wren, he said. Not mine, not his, yours. The law speaks of releasing you to your pack. The law speaks of proper hands and proper words and alphas and rights. His eyes held hers. But the law, Thorn said, has never once asked the woman whether she wishes to release herself. The hall did not understand it at first. Wren did. She had carried it down the mountain in her own two hands. She had turned it over 100 times in the honey gold light of her small, warm room. She had found the door no one had thought to close, because it had never occurred to the men who wrote the law that the thing they were passing between them might want to let itself go. She stepped forward to the council table where the old instruments of right were laid out on dark cloth, and among them the iron severance pin, long as a hand, plain, ancient, the tool by which proper hands cut the bond thread of an omega. She picked it up. Her hand knew the weight of iron. She had carried her mother's all her life. She closed her fingers around the pin, and she turned to face the hall, and she lifted her chin. Then I release myself, she said. For a moment, no one moved. Then a counselor found his voice. It cannot be done. The thread is woven into the body. It does not answer to the one who carries it. It never has. Then it has never been asked, Wren said. And she set the edge of the iron pin against her own palm. The bond thread an omega carries to her birth pack is not a knot you can pick loose. It is woven through the body, through 24 years of belonging to a place that did not want her. It does not let go because you ask it to. It does not believe you have the right. Wren spoke the old words of release, the words she had heard once, long ago, spoken over another woman by the proper hands, and the bond fought her. It came up cold, a cold with grief in it. The grief of every year she had spent making herself small enough to be kept by people who would discard her anyway. The grief of the altar, and the clasp ringing on the stone, and the faces that would not meet her eyes. The cold of a whole life spent being told what she was worth by men who never once asked. It closed on the air in her lungs. Frost crept white along the back of her hand. The bond did not believe she had the right to let it go. It had been woven by men, and held by men, and cut by men, and it did not know what to do with a woman who reached into her own chest and took hold of it herself. The edge of the iron pin bit into her palm, and the blood came warm, warm against all that cold. red and living and hers, welling up between her fingers, dripping dark onto the pale stone of the hall. She held on. She tightened her fist around the iron until it bit deeper, because the cost was hers, and she would pay it in her own coin, and no proper hands would do it for her. And she spoke the words again. Through a throat the cold was trying to close. I release myself freely. The frost crept up her wrist. I belong to no pack. Her voice did not break. That would not stoop to pick up what it dropped. Damon's face, when she said it, was worth the cold. She saw it. Across the whole crowded hall, in the last clear moment before the bond gave way, she saw him understand exactly what she meant, and she saw it land in him like the iron had landed in her palm. The old grief rose up in her, all of it. 24 years of being kept and unkept by people who never chose her, and it broke against a woman who had finally chosen herself. It could not hold, and it let go. The cold went out of the hall all at once, like a held breath released. The bond thread to Damon's pack snapped clean, and the snapping of it rang through the room the way her mother's clasp had once rung on an altar stone. One small, clear final note in a silent hall. Wren stood in the center of it, her own blood warm on her palm, frost melting from her wrist. No man's claim upon her. Free. As free as she had never once been in her whole life. The hall was utterly silent now. 300 alphas, the strongest in the land, and not one of them breathed. Because none of them had ever seen this. None of them had imagined it could be seen. An Omega, the lowest of all of them, standing in the heart of the king's hall with her own bond, severed by her own hand, and her own blood on the stone. Damon sank slowly back into his seat. His claim was ash. There was no bond left to argue over. She carried nothing of his pack now, nothing of any pack, and the old law he had wielded so cleverly had simply fallen out of his hands. He had reached back across the worst day of her life to drag her into his small, certain world, and she had used the reaching to set herself free. Wren turned away from him. She turned toward the dais, toward the king who had set aside everything and demanded nothing, who had handed her the last of his power, and then stepped back from it in the most public room in the land. And she crossed the floor, all of it. The floor he had not let himself cross. The distance he had held all the way up the mountain and all the way down it. Every careful inch of guest and king, and the long, slow waiting. She crossed it on her own 2 feet, with her own blood on her hand, free and chosen by no one but herself. She stopped in front of him, and she looked up into the face of the strongest man in the land, the man who had bought candles and dreaded pheasants and made terrible honey cakes, the man who had knelt in an empty hall to pick her dignity up off the floor and then spent half a year making sure she would never need him to. Now, Wren said, quietly, so that the whole silent hall had to lean in to hear it. Ask me. His hands were not steady. A lichen king, the strongest of all the great bloodlines. And his hands shook as he reached for the deep blue Luna's cloak that Hollis brought forward, as he lifted it, as he laid it once more across her shoulders, this time as a thing she had walked the whole length of the world to claim. He drew it close at her throat, and the clasp he fastened it with was not silver. It was not new. It was iron, plain, worn thin by 100 years of women's hands. Her mother's clasp, the one she had left ringing on an altar stone, the one she had walked away from rather than kneel for. He had mended it. The broken hinge was joined now with a thread of fine silver, so fine and so deliberate that the seam showed. He had not hidden the break. He had not smoothed it away and pretended it had never happened. He had kept the break and made it part of the whole and let the mending shine. Wren looked down at the iron and the silver, the wound and the healing, fastened together at her throat where everyone could see. Her mother's clasp, holding the cloak of a queen. Wren of the high road, Thorn said, and the careful campaign was gone from his voice. The parade ground armor, the dread. There was only the man underneath it, who had waited a whole turn of the year for this, and would have waited another and another, for as long as it took her to choose. "Will you let me spend my reign?" he said, trying to be worth the choosing. The whole hall held its breath, and Wren, who had been chosen once, loudly, in front of everyone, and unmade in the same breath. Wren, who had walked away from an altar with her heart on the floor and built a life out of beeswax and honey and her own two stubborn hands. Wren, who had reached into her own chest and torn out 24 years of grief and set herself free in front of the strongest wolves in the land, reached up and drew his great head down to hers. It was not loud. It was not the kind of kiss the songs are written about, the kind made in front of crowds to prove a thing. It was quiet. It was warm, and what broke open in her was not heat, but the simple staggering relief of being seen all the way down to the floor of herself, and chosen there anyway. The hall and the council and the man who had unmade her all fell away. And there was only the one true thing. And this time, Wren let it be true. There is an old law older than the one Damon had tried to wield. By that law, when a king's Luna is confirmed before the council, every alpha in the hall must bend the knee to her, not to the king, to her. It is the oldest courtesy of the packs, older than crowns, older than borders, older than the careful schemes of careful men. It cannot be refused, and it does not care, not in the slightest, whether a man's heart is in the bending. So when Wren drew back from that kiss, and the deep blue cloak settled true upon her shoulders with her mother's mended clasp shining at her throat, the council rose as one and spoke the words that made her Luna in the eyes of every pack in the land. And then they knelt. 300 alphas, the strongest wolves in the world. They went down on one knee on the cold stone, all of them, in a long, slow wave that rolled outward from the dais to the farthest shadowed corner of the hall. The sound of it filled the room, wool against stone, steel shifting, the low collective breath of 300 proud creatures lowering themselves at once, and Damon knelt with them. He had no choice. The law he had carried into that hall an hour before, so clever and so sharp, the law he had been so certain would drag her back into his small world. That same law now wielded him. It bent his knee. It pressed his proud head down. It put the man who had let her mother's clasp ring on the stone onto the floor before the Omega he had thrown away. His face was gray. His climb was finished, and he knew it, and the whole hall knew it, and there was nowhere left for his pride to hide. Wren looked down at him. She did not raise her voice. She had learned, in a cold hall a long year before, that the quietest thing said in a silent room is the loudest, that a whisper, dropped into the right moment, lands harder than any shout. A shout, she had once thought. She could have answered. It was the gentleness that had unmade her. So now she gave him gentleness back, the terrible quiet kind. You should have looked down. Damon went still on his knee. It rang, Wren said. My mother's clasp. It struck the stone, and it rang, and the whole hall heard it. And you could not be troubled to look at the floor. She let that sit in the silence. She let it spread out across the kneeling alphas, into the high, cold corners, up to the gallery where once a hooded stranger had stood and watched her walk away. Everything that has happened to you since, she said, began in that one moment. Not when the king bought candles. Not when I walked through those doors tonight in blue. There. Her eyes held his and did not let go. When a thing fell at your feet and rang, and you decided it was not worth the bending of your neck to see what it was. She did not say the rest. She did not need to. The whole hall had already understood the rest, that what had fallen at his feet, ringing, unbent for, had not only been a clasp of worn iron. It had been a woman, whole and brave and worth more than every soul in that hall. And he had let her ring on the stone, and roll, and stop, and he had looked away. Damon left the high fortress in disgrace before the gathering ended. His standing was broken. The council's favor, which a man like him had spent his whole grasping life courting, was simply gone, the way warmth goes out of a hall when a door is left open to the snow. He gathered what was left of his pride, and he rode out alone down the long river road, and not one alpha rose to see him off. Wren watched from a high window as the dark line of him grew small and smaller, and was gone. She will not pretend, even now, that the cloak on her shoulders did not feel a little warmer for the watching. She had earned that warmth. She did not apologize for it, but she found, as the river road took him, that she did not hate him the way she had once expected to. There was no triumph in it, in the end. Only a strange, quiet astonishment that a man could hold a whole life in his two hands. A woman who would have given him everything. A pact that trusted him. A future worth the having. And let all of it ring on the stone, and never once look down. It was not cruelty that had unmade Damon. She understood that now. It was carelessness. The comfortable, casual certainty that some people are simply worth less. That a thing of low birth, once dropped, does not need to be looked at again. That the world is divided into those who matter and those who do not, and that the dividing is so obvious it requires no checking. And Wren thought, watching the river road empty, that this was the more dangerous thing in all the world, not the men who hate, the men who do not bother to look. There was fallout, of course. There is always fallout. A lichened king who sets aside his own claim in open council, who stands before 300 alphas and lets his chosen Luna sever her own bond with her own blood on the stone, is not a thing the great houses forget in a hurry. There were lords who muttered, who said the king had let himself be made to look weak, who whispered, behind their hands, that a queen should come from a great house, with a great name, and not up a mountain road smelling of beeswax and wood smoke and honest work. Wren heard the mutters. She did not let them touch her, because for every lord who muttered, there was someone else. She began to notice them in the weeks that followed, at the edges of the great hall, in the quiet corners of the council gatherings, where the light did not quite reach. Women, mostly. Daughters of houses high and houses low. Women who had been chosen once and unchosen later. Women who had never been chosen at all. Women who had been chosen and then folded slowly inward, year upon year, made smaller and smaller to fit a place they had never agreed to stand in, until there was hardly a woman left inside the shape of them. They looked at her differently than the lords did. They looked at the deep blue cloak, and the iron clasp with its silver mending plane and unhidden at her throat, and the Omega who had walked the whole length of that hall and set herself free in front of the strongest wolves in the land. And one by one, in their quiet corners, they stood a little straighter. That was when Wren understood what her transformation was truly for. It was not the cloak. It was not the title, which she wore lightly and would have set down without much grief. It was not even the man, though she came to love him more with each turning season, in the slow and careful way that lasts, the way that does not burn bright and gutter out, but banks down warm and deep and steady, like a fire kept all winter. It was this, that she knew in her own scarred working hands exactly what the floor of that hall felt like against the soles of a woman's feet when she walks away from it with her chin up and her heart in pieces. She knew it from the inside, and no one who has been left on that floor ever truly forgets the cold of it. So she made it her work, not the work of a queen as the lords imagined a queen, not silk and ceremony and the endless careful arithmetic of alliance and advantage. The other work, the work no one had thought a queen would lower herself to do. She began, quietly at first, to gather them, the set aside, the folded inward, the thrown away. The women who had been told all their lives, by men who never once bothered to look, exactly how little they were worth, until they had begun to believe it in their bones. She gave them a place, not a charity. She hated the word, and she would not allow it spoken in her hall. A charity is a thing handed down from above by people who feel large for the handing, and Wren had spent her whole life being handed things from above, and she knew precisely what it does to a person to live on what they did not earn. So she gave them work instead. She gave them the one coin that has never once asked where a woman was born, or whose altar she was shamed at, or what a small certain man had decided she was worth. There were hives now in the wide gardens of the high fortress. There were vats of mead cooling in the deep cellars. There were candles to be dipped, layer over patient layer, smooth and heavy and gold as the last light of a long afternoon. And there was, for any woman who came up that mountain road with her heart on the floor and nothing left but the clothes she stood in, a pair of hands that knew the weight of iron, and a voice that said simply, without a scrap of pity in it, because pity would only have been one more way of looking down on her: you are not a debt. You are not the wrong cup handed back. The fact that someone failed to see your worth is a fact about their eyes. It was never, not once, a fact about you. She watched them change, slowly, the way she herself had changed, the way the bees had taken her measure that first cold spring, when she had no fear left to give them, and let her stay. She watched the folded ones unfold, an inch at a time, a season at a time. She watched the silent ones find, somewhere down in the work of their own hands, the first rough edges of a voice. She watched women who had arrived unable to meet her eyes learn, slowly, to lift their chins and hold a gaze and say a hard thing plainly. And she made it the one law of her hall that she cared about above all the others, the law that mattered more to her than any treaty or border or careful word of state, that no woman would ever again be left scrabbling on the floor for her own dignity while Wren was Luna of that place, not while she drew breath. Not in any hall she had a say in. Celeste came up the mountain road in the autumn. Wren had not expected her. She had thought of Celeste rarely, and without much heat. The noble's daughter had been a prop in Damon's proving, the same as Wren had been, only standing on the other side of the altar. Two women set against each other by a man too small to see either of them whole. It is an old trick, and a cheap one, and it works far more often than it should. But Celeste, it turned out, had not had the Luna's life she was promised. She had married into Damon's small, certain world, and she had watched that world crumble around her after the gathering, and she had learned, slow and bitter, exactly what it is to be wanted not for yourself, but for what your wanting says about a man's price in the eyes of other men. She arrived at the gate in plain wool. No silk, no gold, her fine clothes left behind, or sold, or simply no longer hers. She stood in the courtyard among the humming hives, and she did not seem to know what to do with her hands. And for a long moment the two women who had once stood on opposite sides of that altar simply looked at each other across the autumn light. "I came to apologize," Celeste said at last. The words came out stiff, unpracticed, the words of a woman who has not had much occasion in her life to mean them. "For the altar. I knew. When he chose me, when he set that cloak on my shoulders, I knew what he was doing to you. And I let him. I stood there, and I let him, because it lifted me up to stand where you were meant to stand. I thought I had won something." Her voice thinned. "I had not. I had only been chosen by a man who throws women away, which is to say, I had only borrowed your place in the line." Wren said nothing for a moment. She had imagined this conversation, once or twice, in the early bitter days on the mountain. In those imaginings, she had been cruel and clever and quick, and she had enjoyed every word of it. But she found, standing now in the autumn light among her bees, that she did not want to be cruel. She knew too well by now what it was to be a woman arranged by a man for his own small ends. And she had decided, somewhere along the long road of her changing, that she would not become a woman who did to others what had been done to her. That was the whole point of any of it. "He used you too," Wren said. "He set you in my place the same way he set me down. Neither of us was ever a woman to him. We were both just moves on a board he thought he was clever enough to win." Celeste's eyes filled. "You could have had everything," she said, looking around her. "The whole land at your feet. And instead, you built this." She took in the hives, the smoke, the wax, the quiet, steady industry of women bent to honest work. Why? Why would a queen do this? "Because someone has to look down," Wren said. Celeste did not understand. So Wren told her about the clasp, the ringing of it on the stone, the man who would not look at the floor. And she watched the understanding move across Celeste's face, slow and painful, the way it had moved across Damon's on his kneeling. "Stay, if you want," Wren said when the telling was done. "There is work here. The work asks nothing about where you came from." A small pause, and the ghost of something that was not quite a smile. "Or who you stood beside at an altar." Celeste stayed. And in time, in her own season, she unfolded too. The bees came up the mountain in the spring after the bonding. 6 old hives. Thorn brought them himself. He had them carried up the high road on a slow cart, and he walked beside the cart the whole long way, refusing the dignity of riding ahead, because he had learned in the patient weeks of a candlemaker's small warm room that his Luna was only ever entirely herself, with her hands full of honest work. It was not that a Luna must keep bees. It was that this Luna was a woman made whole by the keeping of them. And he was a man who paid close, careful, ceaseless attention to the things that made a person whole. The court did not know, at first, what to make of a queen who came to council smelling of beeswax and wood smoke, who had small white scars on her working hands, who would rise from a gathering of the great houses in the middle of their careful arithmetic and go out to tend a swarm because the swarm needed tending more than the lords needed agreeing with. They have grown used to it. They have grown used to a great many things. He still asks her the question. That is the part Wren did not expect, and the part she has come to treasure most of all. Every so often, in the quiet of the high chambers, with the bees asleep in the garden walls, and a single beeswax candle burning low and gold between them, Thorn will go very still, and his voice will drop into that careful young register, the one he wore in the early days, standing in the doorway of a candlemaker's kitchen with the cold still clinging to his wool. And he will ask her whether she is only suffering him. He means it as a joke now, mostly. But underneath the joke, there is still the boy who once watched a strong man fold a woman inward, year upon year, until she was gone, and swore he would never be that hand. There is still a king who cannot quite believe, even now, that the woman chose him, that she crossed the whole length of that crowded hall with her own blood warm on her palm, and no man's claim upon her, and reached up and drew his great head down to hers, and chose him in front of the world. So she answers him the same way every time. She tells him no, she is not suffering him. She has never once been suffering him. And every time, the strongest wolf in the land looks like a man who still cannot quite believe the campaign was won. He passed through her workroom this very morning. The light was still thin and gold and new, and the first of the day's candles were cooling on their wooden racks, and she was bent over the next batch with the warm, sweet smell of melting wax all around her. He stopped behind her chair. He did not say anything. He only set something down on the table beside her hand, and went on his way with the small private smile of a very large man who has gotten away with something. It was a candle. Beeswax. Badly dipped. Lopsided, with a thin spot near the top where the wax had run too quick. Made by a king who has a whole hall full of master chandlers at his command and insists, season after season, on making his own. Poorly. Because it is the joke that started them. The dozen candles he did not need. The reason he could not think of an honest one to give. And he will not let it go. The same way he will not let the question go. Because these small foolish things are the bones of what the two of them built, and a man who pays attention does not throw the bones away. Wren keeps every one of them, a whole drawer full of badly dipped candles, lopsided, runny, uneven, each one lit by a king's own clumsy, patient hands. She would not trade that drawer for all the silver in all the great houses below. A letter came up the mountain not long ago, from the pack that raised her, the pack that promised her and set her down and let her walk the length of a silent hall with not one single face meeting her eyes. It was written in a careful, frightened hand, the hand of people who have realized, far too late, the worth of the thing they let fall and would not bend to pick up. There were words in it about pride, and about regret, and about how there was a place for her still, an honored place, should she ever wish to return to the people who had thrown her away. Wren read it once. She has not decided how to answer it. She has a long time to decide. She has a fortress full of candles she no longer has to sell to anyone, and a garden full of bees that are entirely her own, and a hall full of unfolded women who once could not lift their chins and now meet the world full in the face. And she has a king who makes her lopsided candles, and asks her still, in a voice gone young and careful, whether she is only suffering him. She is in no hurry. Perhaps she will answer the letter. Perhaps she will simply let it lie, unanswered, the way she once let a clasp lie on an altar stone, because some things are not worth the bending of your neck and the cost of your dignity to take back up. She has not yet decided, and she has come to understand that the deciding being hers, entirely, slowly, unhurried, and answerable to no living soul, is the whole of what she fought for on that cold floor with the iron pin biting into her palm. The freedom was never going to be in the cloak. The freedom was in the choosing. She keeps her mother's clasp on the cloak still. She will not have it hidden. The silver mending shows, plain and bright at her throat, where anyone who cares to look can see the place it was broken and the place it was made whole again. The court whispered about that in the early days, a queen wearing mended iron when she might wear flawless silver. It was, they said, beneath her, unseemly, a reminder of low things best forgotten. Wren let them whisper, because she had learned a thing by then about iron and about clasps and about women, and even, given a year and a great deal of patience and an ocean of badly made candles, about kings. A thing that has been broken and chose to hold is stronger than a thing that was never tested. The flawless silver in the great houses below has never once been asked to bear a real weight. It is pretty. It is smooth. It is whole. And it has not the faintest idea what it is truly made of, because nothing has ever tried to break it. But the iron at her throat knows exactly what it is made of. It rang on a stone once in a silent hall at the feet of a man who would not look down. It lay on cold marble while a woman walked away from it, rather than kneel in front of a pack that had thrown them both aside. It was carried half a year in a king's closed fist. It was mended with a fine silver seam left deliberately, defiantly, bare. And it holds. It holds the deep blue cloak of a queen who was once an omega, on the shoulders of a woman who reached into her own chest and tore out a whole long life of being told what she was worth, and let it go, and set herself free. Some evenings, when the candle burns low and the bees murmur drowsy in the walls, and the great hall is quiet at last, Wren will lift one hand to her throat and touch the place where the iron meets the silver, the break and the healing fastened together in the one small clasp. And she will think about the floor of a hall a long year gone. She will think about every woman somewhere out in the wide dark world tonight, still walking away from an altar with her heart in pieces, certain her life is over, certain she will never be seen, certain the cold of that floor is the last thing she will ever feel. And she will hope, with everything in her, that someone in that woman's hall is paying attention, that someone looks down, that someone bends their neck to see what rang on the stone and stoops and picks it up and keeps it safe, not to own it, never to own it, but to hand it back, mended, on an open palm, when the woman is strong enough to take it for herself, because the worst hour of a life can become the first hour of something else entirely. Wren knows. She walked the whole long length of that hall to find out, and the iron at her throat, mended and shining and unhidden and unashamed, holds